This chapter is about the bones and an introduction to the skeletal system. In the book, there are two more chapters following this that show the specific bones, their shape, their features, and their location in the body as a whole. But this particular chapter is focusing on what bones are and especially how they grow. The skeleton is primarily composed of bones, and we'll talk about their structure and how they operate as organs in the next section. However, it's worth pointing out that the skeleton also contains other components. At the joints, we have quite a bit of other connective tissues in the terms of cartilage and joint capsules. And you could include in with the skeleton, after a sense, the idea that the lower respiratory tract, which is completely surrounded by cartilage and not bone, serves some similar functions there. This is a list of some of the functions of bones, and I just want to point out that as I start most of the organ systems for this course, I will begin with an overview of the functions to give a big picture of what the system's for. And then as we learn the specifics of the system, you can fit that into this bigger picture for an understanding of what's going on. Probably most people think of the skeleton in terms of these functions. It provides support for the body, it protects major organ systems, and it's the basement for movement. The picture here demonstrates how the skull, for instance, is protecting the central nervous system, the brain specifically. Another example of that would be how the rib cage protects the lungs and heart and other thoracic organs. Also, however, you can think of protection as being more than just surrounding the outside of organ systems, but the femur, for instance, the thigh bone, is protective in that it's the structure for the upper leg, and the soft tissues around it are protected by that. Other functions that don't tend to be in the popular conscious as much are mineral storage and blood cell formation. The bone matrix is a crystallized structure primarily of calcium phosphate crystals, and it's where we store a lot of calcium when we have excess in our body, and we release it when our body needs it at other times. We'll actually look at the homeostatic mechanism regulating calcium homeostasis later in this chapter. The bone's also where blood cells are made. It's not the bone tissue that does that, rather that within the bone as an organ there's another tissue called red bone marrow that's responsible for producing blood cells. And it's red because primarily it's making red blood cells. Bone also has yellow bone marrow in it, which is essentially adipose tissue, and it acts as a storage compartment for that energy-rich tissue. In looking at the shapes of bones and considering how they come to be in the first place, we can classify bones into a few different types. Now, this classification of bones isn't crucial really to understanding the skeleton so much, but it does help to understand the context in which we're going to be discussing certain things. For example, when we talk about the structure of bones as an organ and about how bones develop, we're going to concentrate really on one type that we see here and then expand on that to include the other types as they develop. The first type of bone to discuss is called a long bone, and this will be the one that we tend to start with as an example bone. One we're seeing here is the femur, or the thigh bone, which is probably the biggest of them. Now, what distinguishes a long bone is the fact that it has a shaft, cylindrical shaft down its length with an enlarged flaring head at either end. We'll talk about the particular structures and the names that we use to describe them in a little while, but that's the basic layout of a long bone. Now, being a long bone doesn't necessarily mean that it's a certain length. In fact, there are some very, very small long bones in our body. The bones of the fingers and the toes, called the phalanges, are each a long bone. They have that same cylindrical shaft with a head at either end. But some of them can be very, very short. The last knuckle on your fingers or in your toes are very, very short bone. They are considered long bones based on their shape. The next type of bone classified by shape is what we call a short bone. They're characterized by having length and width dimensions that are fairly similar, so they're kind of shaped like a cube. Most importantly, they have a flat face, usually where they articulate with other bone. Being a short bone doesn't necessarily refer to their size so much, just like with long bones. There are short bones that are bigger than certain long bones. Again, it's about their shape. Typically, we think of short bones as being the bones of the wrist and the ankle, carpals and the tarsals. The third type of bone classified by shape is called a flat bone. Now, the example here is the sternum, which is a fairly small bone, and its flatness seems pretty absolute. But really, flat bones tend to have a bit of a curve to them. Another example of a flat bone is the rib, and you can see actually in this frame here that the ribs actually curve quite a far ways around the thoracic cavity. But in cross-section, these two bones are going to have the same basic appearance. And the cranial bones are also flat. Now, of course, they're going to have quite a bit of curve as they make up the cranial vault. The fourth type of bone based on shape is called an irregular bone. And this is really a bone that doesn't fit into any of the other three types. This example is a vertebral bone. It has characteristics similar to some of the other bone shapes. For example, the vertebral bodies are flat surfaces where they come into contact with an adjacent bone. Or the spinous process coming out of the posterior part, which is the top of this picture, is rather flat, like a flat bone. But it can't be classified as one or the other, and irregular bones are usually that, completely unlike the other types. The sesamoid bone is the final shape of bone that we're going to consider here. And I've put it at the end because it's different from the rest. All of those others develop in a particular way, or two particular ways that we'll discuss later on. Sesamoid bones are different in that they calcify out of other soft tissues. And the one that everybody has is the patella, or the kneecap, which is actually just a calcification of the tendon from the muscle in your thigh called the quadriceps before it connects to the tibia, or your shin bone. Other people will have sesamoid bones in other places, it's just they're not common for everybody. There's a tendency for sesamoid bones to develop around certain bones of the toes or the fingers as the tendons that move across those bones get stimulated or irritated and they start to calcify. The patella is the only one that's common for everybody. Consider this question. When you feel that you've reached an answer, hit the next button to go into the next slide, which will reveal the correct answer. While there is potassium stored in bone also, the main mineral that we're going to pay the most attention to in this course is calcium. Bone matrix is really a crystallization of calcium phosphate salt, and we're going to look at the homeostasis of that particular mineral in detail later on.